Well, hi there and welcome back to the Drawing Database. Professor Marc Leone here. And today we're going to spend 15 minutes with the work of Giotto, Italian, considered to be the grandfather, if you will, of the Renaissance. He was Italian, born in 1267 and died in 1337. So we can see Giotto as the driving force behind the attitude and spirit for the Renaissance. Certainly he was still a medieval artist, but a burgeoning Renaissance artist, and really our transitional major figure from the Middle Ages, if you think about illuminated manuscripts and the homogeneous repetitive work and flat work of stained glass, of medieval sculpture, and also medieval painting, and also mosaic, the flat character, and a character much more driven by an aspect type of art rather than a naturalism that we start to get in here with Giotto. So we'll look at Giotto's work mostly in fresco here. To my knowledge, there are no existent drawings. If there are, I haven't found them, and forgive me if they're not. But we'll look at the quality of the fresco work, mostly biblical and mythological type story. So what we see in Giotto now is still a stylization, a relative flatness. We also see a burgeoning understanding here and here, and some of the foreground, middle ground, background elements of linear perspective. But we still get a very high degree of flatness with the drawing of the figures that we see. And we can bump this up a little bit to take a look at them. Mary here, and some of the other figures with the robes. So these favor well with medieval art or Byzantine art, a flatness, also to, in some sense, Egyptian art, but we still see much more understanding of naturalism in terms of painting and value system on the robe, an actual three-dimensional, soft, gilded, gliding feeling with the robes, some natural foot positions with the structure of the drawing. So we see Giotto's understanding of where art can be pushed, starting to begin to, if you will, burgeon into our next period, which will be the early to middle to high Renaissance. Of course, we still get flatness with the palm trees, but the lovely feeling of some of the turns and curves we get are very nice. Here we see Giotto illustrating prudence, one of the attributes of high integrity with human beings. We see some attempts at a slight two-point perspective. We see again, if you look down here, we see a slight askew and askew here. So we've got a nice slight two-point perspective feeling going on, if you will, of the pedestal or podium that this person is sitting on, or working with, or judging with, in terms of prudence. And we see a three-dimensional rendering of the form, a turning. It's all meant to feel like it's in stone. It's encapsulated into an illusion of a notch or a cornice, if you will. So there's the illusion of more depth and space, and the illusion of marble in the painting. So the drawing is very crisp, it's very sharp and very solid with respect to the man-made podium, the little framed apses in through here, and then the figure is in the same color range, so it's almost meant to be like a sculpture, even though it's three-dimensional drawing slash painting. And we get nice modeling in the facial features that we see, the rendering there of what we get from Giotto. So there is a really lovely sense of understanding of three-dimensional form, the turning of forms, especially cylindrical forms with respect to the neck, right, and the head. So these really turn, and these really turn and turn and turn around and turn around here with the drawing. So that works quite lovely and quite well with the drawing. And remember, this is late medieval, late Gothic. Here we see an image of Giotto rendering what is a detailed shot of a judgment day, or final judgment. We see figures being harangued, sinners, if you will, being harangued by a bestial man, a devil, if you will, or a demon, if you will, and then a serpent here on the other side, demon here on this side, haranguing sinners that are now nude, being choked and being strangled and being severely tortured. We see the early action of Giotto, so the figures are a little less stiff and more in a active kind of gestured pose. So we have this curvy linear feeling in through here with the gesture. The understanding of anatomy is minimal, so these are drawn certainly from his memory or certainly his imagination rather than from observation. So we do see a relative awkwardness and stiffness still with the figures, but we get a beautiful design with the curvy linear quality of the serpent into the demon, and of course then back onto the figures. And then we see the hatching technique of the rendering within the modeling of the head forms, and still holding on to a very kind of Byzantine, heavily outlined drawing approach and painting approach to the faces. And then if we pull back from that scene, then we get the entire composition. The excerpt that I showed you obviously is right in there. And here we have the king of Hades or hell. We have Satan here at the lowest level. So this image was probably influenced, I can't say for sure since I wasn't in the mind of Giotto, but probably influenced by Dante in his Divine Comedy, and in this case by the Inferno and the suffering that goes on in that trilogy, especially in the Inferno, of sinners and their expulsion into certain rounds, different rounds of hell. So it's still very medieval. I believe Dante wrote the book sometime in the 1200s, so Giotto, again, was born in 1267. And what we see here is a very vibrant and bright use of space, composition, and maturing understanding of figuration, even though they're still relatively stiff and awkward anatomically. And anatomy, the understanding of anatomy as it relates to drawing, still had not been studied yet. And you'll see the difference when we get to the High Renaissance with major figures such as Michelangelo and Raphael and so on, if you're following along chronologically. But we get the understanding and the movement here to science involved in the arts, literature in the arts, and this is an inspiration for artists to come after Giotto. Again, in a multi-figured piece, and we can compare this to Michelangelo later on with his Last Judgment on the walls of the Sistine Chapel. Another image by Giotto, we see a gospel here of what is perhaps the death of Christ or the death of a saint in the celestial movement up to very flat composition. So he involves flatness, horizontally moving across. We do get some movement of the figures, some foreshortening of the figures right in through here, which he controls beautifully, quite frankly, for that time. So there's a lovely understanding of form in these images from a observed quality. There is a stiffness and a flatness and scale issues, but that we understand with this late medieval, early Renaissance art. You can compare these works to other masters at that time, Cimabue especially, and you see the difference in the style where Cimabue was thoroughly ensconced still in medieval flatness, and Giotto had begun to move on into this transition phase into more 3D realism in the study of light and value and how that reacts on form in addition to human proportion and scale. The robes are especially well studied and especially naturalistic and flowy, as well as most of the views of the face. Most of them are profile, but we do get an attempt at some tilted heads, downward heads here at the bottom of the composition too, and then of course the praying figure there. So if we look at the structure of perspective and we understand where Giotto was, we understood that the Romans had at least had a rudimentary, if not a more advanced understanding of one-point perspective, perhaps two. And somewhere along the lines, it was lost in the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, or the Gothic era in art. And here we can see Giotto bringing this understanding back as we have an exorcism of demons out of the city by this particular saint, it looks as if. And we see an attempt here at the architecture to involve one, or in this case, 2-point, a slight 2-point, since this angle is not parallel to us, and we have different viewpoints. It doesn't necessarily work out, but it does give us, or it doesn't work out, in a unified way, but what it does give us is insight into Giotto's thinking and understanding that there are multiple viewpoints, 1-point and 2-point, as he is fairly consistent with his angles in 2-point. Here it gets a little bit awkward, but overall the clarity of the crispness of the architecture and its use of value in his drawing and painting are remarkable for that time. Here we see what is believed to be an image of Christ reverting in his communication with his God, or the Heavenly Father, here in a scene, perhaps marching to his crucifixion, or perhaps some other idea that goes on here in the narrative. But what we do see is typical Giotto, with a horizontal laid out structure of relatively natural looking figures that get more active. We can see, look at the pose of this figure, the movement of the legs to get more of a moving forward view. Children here, as well as heads looking in different directions rather than all in profile, different viewpoints. And then really a lovely attempt, I think, for the time, of emotion into the quality of the faces and the rendering of soft light on these faces, and some anatomy with the ribs, the laps, the teres major, minor, the deltoid, and so on. So we get some sophistication, and again an echoing and a foreshadowing of what's to come in art as artists after Giotto push this idea much further. And again, also some wonderful attempts at angles for 1 and 2-point, mostly 2-point perspective. But you can't quite get it consistent overall. You see the angles here are not as consistent. Not that they're parallel. They should not be parallel, but this angle should be much more acute there as well to get that all consistent. So he was very close to bringing that to conclusion. And we will see that being brought to its ultimate conclusion later on, about 200 years later, with Bernini and his mastery of perspective, and pushed forward by Uccello and then the High Renaissance. And here we have our final image for Giotto, encapsulated into what could be referred to as a little intimate chapel, some sort of a blessing or annunciation here, or perhaps a mourning of a funeral. I can't quite tell, but we do see Giotto with his illusionism of not only the robes. Check out the beautiful drawing and the flowiness of the robes in their kind of bell shape. Not too much action in the figures, but we also see a figure moving down off the stairwell, quite lovely, into some emotional quality, with the head in through here looking upward. The scale is awkward, so the structure that they're sitting in and acting in is meant to be pushed back, but the scale of the figures is a little awkward in terms of relating that. And then we get some scale changes with the head that are somewhat awkward, but the naturalization of pushing the perspective and the feet in proper angularity work quite well. The stairs are awkward, but they're in a roughly 2-point view drawn, and they're fairly consistent as we get to the tread, or the flat part starts to get thinner and thinner as we move up, and then there's some interesting inconsistencies within the structure that he draws that they're in, but the detailing is wonderful, and it really foreshadows again the High Renaissance in its use of wonderful 1-2-point perspective as well. Certainly with Albert Dürer, the conclusive person to use two-point perspective for the first time in his print of St. Jerome at his study. And I think also the naturalization of Giotto's fresco painting to mimic the marble Italian harkens back to the first style of painting, of Roman painting, or the encrusted style as well, to mimic the feeling of stone and the feeling of marble or fine manufactured hand smoothed wood. Excuse me, not wood, but stone processes as well. So there's Giotto, a wonderful transition artist and the grandfather of the Renaissance. Take care. Bye-bye.